The world is in the midst of an economic downturn.
Certainly, a global recession is a major risk.
Three of our biggest economic engines are sputtering, from war in Europe to a lockdown China and rising inflation. A bitter blend is hitting the world's economic powerhouses.
And there is no sort of point of light at the end of the tunnel here, because it all now begins to feed on each other.
In this video, we will be asking what makes this economic downturn so different from the Great Recession in 2008.
This is a recession that is unlike perhaps the financial crisis recession that was due to the financial crisis, that is being felt by every single individual.
Definitely for the years to come, we are going to witness a world from a Chinese perspective that we are not accustomed to.
We will discover the paradoxes that make this downturn unique.
So the labor market actually looks quite good, which is one of the confusing things about today's economy.
We will assess how easily this crisis can be remedied compared to the last.
We don't have tools at the moment that could address the recession that we're facing.
And we will look at the countries who are bucking the negative trend. That's all coming up on Business Beyond.
Both the IMF and the World Bank are warning that we are edging towards a global recession. But determining what counts as a recession and what doesn't can be complicated.
There is no official definition. A common rule of thumb is that when an economy experiences 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, it's in recession. But a decline in GDP isn't the only indicator. Other metrics like unemployment levels and consumer confidence also play a role.
People lose their jobs, they have to cut into their savings. Unemployment can be extremely disruptive personally, not just for economic reasons, but for one's sense of well-being.
For a recession to happen, many factors are at play. That's why declaring a recession is often in the hands of national organizations that analyze business cycles.
Like national recessions, global ones also don't have a clear-cut definition. They happen when a large number of major economies are going through an economic slump.
In our globalized economy, a recession in one place spells trouble for another. Knock-on effects reverberate throughout the globe.
And that's what has analysts worried right now.
Certainly, a global recession is a major risk, but our current forecast has what we would call a growth recession. We do not have a contraction in the global economy, but we have subpar growth with rising unemployment.
GDP growth in the global economy is slowing down. The International Monetary Fund projects that a third of the world economy will likely be in a technical recession next year. The US and Eurozone are facing an especially gloomy outlook. In the US, economic growth is declining to a fifth of its 2021 levels next year. In the Eurozone, growth is almost completely stalling. For many of us, the phrase global recession still conjures up images of publicly shamed bankers and people losing their houses. To understand the current economic downturn better, it's worth revisiting what happened in 2008 during the financial crisis. It pushed the world's banking system towards the edge of collapse and left borrowers no longer able to afford their homes.
And it all started with a housing bubble in the US. A whole industry ballooned around giving people mortgages.
Mortgage brokers eventually got greedy. They started giving out loans to people that didn't make enough money to pay them back. Those mortgages were combined into big packages and sold to banks. Ultimately, the inevitable happened. Borrowers couldn't pay their loans back, and the house of cards collapsed, causing a banking crisis.
The first recession was a recession that was essentially one that was built on fear of banks and mistrust between banks, because they weren't sure anymore which of the banks was solvent and which one wasn't, so they stopped lending altogether.
Banks had to be rescued from ruin by government bailouts, and the crisis spread beyond the United States. European banks had bought a lot of bad mortgages from the US, so they also collapsed and had to be bailed out by governments. Many European countries eventually could no longer pay their own debt. Government budgets were squeezed, resulting in years of austerity and dramatically impacting the lives of millions of Europeans. So how is the current economic downturn different? This time around, money isn't the issue.
There is no capital shortage. In fact, if anything, banks and the capital markets are sitting on loads of money that at the moment they can't really spend because there is nothing that comes into the EU economy.
So this time, the world isn't short of cash, but it's short of almost everything else.
When the pandemic struck, the fragility of supply chains became apparent. Factories from Asia to Europe and North America halted production, sending the global economy into a freefall. As countries emerged from lockdowns, demand for goods and services returned faster than supply. Now, swelling orders have outstripped availability. Businesses across the economy have struggled to hire workers. Food and energy prices are on the rise. Adding to that, the world's manufacturing powerhouse has closed shop. In China, lockdowns continue to wreak havoc. Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy aims to isolate every individual case of COVID-19. Its strict implementation means regular shutdowns make business and manufacturing extremely difficult.
When they get waves, entire cities are shut down, and that affects the supply chain throughout the world.
Now, shortages of one thing have turned into shortages of another. A scarcity of semiconductors has halted car manufacturing. And unlike during the US-led financial crisis, it's Europe that feels unique pressure now. With the world's supply chains in trouble already, one added factor made for the perfect storm on the continent: the war in Ukraine.
Which woke us up to the realization that Europe is relying on it for one of the most important inputs for its production, namely energy, on a very, very unreliable partner.
For decades, Russia was Europe's main provider of gas, delivering almost half of the bloc's gas supply. But that's drastically changed this year as Europe has rushed to find alternative energy sources.
Europe needs to reduce energy demand by 10%. That already means that we will get into an economy that produces much less.
But it's not just energy that's become a casualty of the war. Ukraine is one of the biggest agricultural exporters in the world. Since the Russian invasion, food prices are on the rise.
For the European and for the global economy, supply shortages and a drastic rise in food and energy costs make for a toxic cocktail.
If the demand stays the same and the supply of a good falls, then the price rises. If you have that across the economy as a whole, in the labor market, in many goods markets, in energy markets and in food markets, then you have a generalized inflation for the first time.
The world is facing an inflation crisis. The US, the United Kingdom, and the Eurozone are especially feeling the price surge. In the EU, inflation is the highest it has ever been. In the US, it's at a 40-year high.
High inflation is a major challenge for all of us.
Around the world, too much money is chasing too few goods. That means items we need for our day-to-day lives are getting more expensive. It's also what makes this economic downturn so different from the last.
This is a recession that is unlike perhaps the financial crisis recession that was due to the financial crisis, that is being felt by every single individual, simply because all of us have to use energy at home. And all of us understand that when inflation is high, with the purchasing power of our salaries or of our income and of our wealth reduces.
The cost of living crisis confronting the world is now causing a shift in global economic policy making. Central bankers say they've had enough of rapid price rises.
We took today's decision and expect to raise interest rates further because inflation remains far too high and is likely to stay above our target for an extended period.
We have both the tools that we need and the resolve it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy.
In 2008, central banks in Europe and the US reduced interest rates to encourage banks to start lending and help economies weather the storm. This time, they're flipping the script.
For every central bank that is currently cutting interest rates, there are now 25 that are raising them, according to Deutsche Bank, a ratio that hasn't been seen in decades. By making it more expensive to buy a car, get a mortgage, or use a credit card, they hope to reduce people's spending and slow inflation. But the tools that will fix rising prices also stall economic growth.
It means that we have two problems. We have both low growth and high prices. And therefore, the policy mix that needs to address this crisis needs to be quite different. And also, the policy mix is a little bit more awkward, if you like, in terms of meeting the two problems.
Central banks are facing a difficult balancing act. Raising interest rates could further sink a rudderless economy. Doing nothing means letting inflation run loose.
There's several real questions that will determine how the next year plays out. First, how effective are central banks in reducing the inflation without sending the economy into, a worse recession that would be required? It's very difficult to get monetary policy just right because there are substantial lags in the system, right? So what's perfect for today, policy-wise, we often can't tell until 6 months down the road.
And something else feels different about this economic downturn, especially in the world's biggest economy, the United States. For many people, the word recession means worrying about losing your job. That's because the two usually go hand in hand.
In the US, GDP went down in 2008 and unemployment went up. This July, the country's unemployment rate was the lowest it has been in half a century, and it has stayed exceptionally low since, despite an economic downturn.
So the labor market actually looks quite good, which is one of the confusing things about today's economy. You have some indicators that look very positive and consistently so, and you have some indicators that are far more worrisome. But the labor market indicator in the US in particular is very strong. Unemployment is quite low. Labor force participation is good. Job openings are high relative to the number of people seeking jobs. So this is a time of enormous labor market opportunity and strength for a lot of American workers.
This is a unique time in the US. Companies can't afford to lose employees because many of them are having problems finding workers in the first place. But the US is facing a paradox. Despite a strong job market, people are worried, especially those looking to start their careers.
Current class of 2023 is certainly worried about the current economic situation. So about 50% of our respondents from one of our most recent surveys shared that they absolutely have some concerns and anxiety.
Things are looking good and gloomy at the same time, and that is making Americans feel uneasy. Consumer sentiment is a measure that shows how people feel about the economy and whether they will spend or save their money. Right now, people are only feeling slightly more optimistic than during the 2008 recession.
And what does that mean for the future of the US economy? The job numbers are looking much rosier than during the last economic downturn, but how people feel is a core driver of economic growth, and a pessimistic outlook can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy.
A very different economy, but one which is also going through a turbulent period, is the world's second largest, China. Decades of surging growth have seen China dramatically catch up with the US economy in terms of size, but policymakers in Beijing are now grappling with a multifaceted economic crisis. The pandemic and a real estate bubble have combined to take a hammer to something which China had come to take for granted: economic growth. China's annual GDP growth has steadily declined over the past decade, somewhat inevitable given how high it has been. Before the pandemic, the country was still recording growth of around 7%. But following a bounce back in 2021, the IMF now expects the Chinese economy to grow by just 3% in 2022.
What we have been witnessing for the past 9 months, roughly, is a continuous slowdown of the growth dynamic in China.
During the 2008 financial crisis, China introduced a huge fiscal stimulus package. Many analysts credit this as the reason China weathered and recovered from that storm much quicker than other major economies.
If you look at the 2008-2009 recession, the Chinese fiscal response was quite strong. Like, they did a good job keeping the Chinese economy going despite that recession, and that was helpful to the world economy as a whole.
If Chinese growth helped the global economy out of the last crisis, it's unlikely to do so this time around. China's zero-COVID policy and the draconian rules that accompany it are a big reason.
That largely send a message to Chinese consumers and investors that now in China, politics trumps everything. When politics would come as an hindrance for economic growth, the Chinese Communist Party would make the right call and let economy prevail. What zero COVID has notified is that perception is, if not wrong, at least no longer viable in Xi Jinping's China.
Zero COVID has dampened Chinese economic sentiment and sapped domestic consumption. Chinese consumer spending is more than 10% less than it was before the pandemic. Another major factor driving China's problems is its housing market. China's property sector has been in crisis since 2020. New government regulations on debt aimed at cooling an overheated real estate market saw companies like Evergrande run out of cash. Soaring property debt has been described as a systemic risk for the entire economy. And since the crisis began, China's housing market has experienced a severe downturn.
Between zero COVID and the real estate crisis, China has enough problems of its own to contend with. And that's having a knock-on effect around the world.
If China is not buying, that means that Europe is not selling. So I think there is an element of sort of bad news, if you like, coming also from the Chinese economy slowing down.
So what does this all mean for China and the world economy as a whole? Well, the Chinese economy is still growing, not contracting, but a slowdown has already begun, and it may be part of a longer-term shift.
There was this almost unbreakable feeling that the Chinese leadership or the Chinese Communist Party, put it as you wanted, would guarantee that their children or the decade to come will be richer than the decade that has just passed. And indeed, that was rooted in almost 5 decades of astonishing economic success. Nowadays, it seems that the Chinese households understand that the growth driver that they've experienced for the past decade has run out of fuel, and that the Chinese leadership in Beijing is ambitioning to redirect the economy towards a new form of equilibrium.
It appears that the engine which helped jumpstart the world out of the last global recession won't be up to the task this time around.
It's clear that the world's biggest economies are facing a storm, but one area of the world has been bucking the trend.
During the 2008 crisis, China was still outpacing its Asian neighbors. Now, for the first time since 1990, other Asian countries are set to outperform China economically. Growth is still outpacing inflation here.
One would have never thought, right? I think it's just the difference in cycles, because Asia, ASEAN and India, they were really buffeted by first the wave in 2020, then the Delta wave in 2021, but thankfully not so much by Omicron. And they are coming out of their lockdowns for most of this year, whereas China went into a lockdown this year because of the zero COVID approach. So just, it's still very much COVID-centric, that difference in terms of their demand.
Emerging economies are benefiting as China's zero-COVID policy is worrying investors.
If China goes into lockdown, where is your alternate production base in Asia? Should you be moving to an Indonesia?
In the Asia-Pacific, Indonesia has been thriving especially against all odds. Economic growth has been outperforming forecasts here, and inflation is still slightly under 6%. The cost of living crisis is crashing down on Europe and the US. But in Indonesia, government fuel subsidies have softened the blow. The Indonesian government is setting its own prices for gas, so-called administered prices.
Indonesia has definitely benefited from a lot of policy support. So the reason inflation is so low is because it's administered price there. And because that has kept that low, the central bank has not been under so much pressure to hike.
The subsidies have amounted to a hefty bill for Indonesia's government and might not be sustainable in the future. At the same time, rising commodity prices around the world have actually helped this economy. Indonesia's coal exporters are bringing in record earnings. The country is looking at a promising 2023.
So at 4.7%, I would still say their growth outlook is looking pretty resilient next year, especially when we talk about major economies entering recession.
At the beginning of this video, we looked back on the recession of 2008 and we asked how this economic downturn will be different. What the experts we spoke to described was a crisis not triggered by banks, but one partially set off by war and by politics.
There's some things that are inevitable, like standing up for democracy, as the Europeans and as Ukraine and as the United States are trying to do right now. I think, the cost of that is not zero, right? But some things are worth paying a cost for. Of course, governments should do whatever they can to cushion their citizens from these costs, but I don't think telling citizens that the cost is zero is realistic or true. And there are some things in life that are, worth making a sacrifice for.
With bank bailouts and regulation, policymakers had the tools to react to the financial crisis. But much of what's happening right now is outside of policymakers' control.
The mechanisms to address the supply side crisis are nothing more than invade China and force them to produce semiconductors, invade Russia and force Putin to stop invading Ukraine and loosen energy supply and so on. And that's obviously not going to happen. So we don't really have tools in the normal state of affairs. We don't have tools at the moment that could address the recession that we're facing.
While central banks intervened to stimulate the economy in 2008, they are adding to a downturn this time. The medicine against rising prices is also poison for the economy.
And unlike the 2008 financial crisis, this downturn is having a much more obvious impact on our daily routines.
Everybody understands that we cannot switch on the heating the coming winter as much as we did in other years, or we are going to see an exorbitant bill. Everybody who has a car will have seen it in the run-up to the in the run-up to the energy crisis, how petrol was so expensive in filling up the car. So this is a crisis that I think dissipates across everybody in the society, and therefore it's much more felt. It's not just about the economic impact. The households feel it. You feel it immediately in your household income.
But there are also positive developments that run opposite to the financial crisis.
We are in a moment where there is great talent shortage. And so even if we do go into a recession, there's still lots of jobs that are available and that are out there.
We are at a unique inflection point in the global economy. Compared to the last crisis, the one we are facing now is much more multifaceted. War in Ukraine, an energy crisis, soaring living costs, and widespread pessimism are combining into an unpredictable economic concoction.
And that's all from this Business Beyond episode. If you enjoyed it, please hit like and subscribe and check out one of our other videos. Until next time, and take care.